The shelves were still full, the notes still accepted, the numbers still printed with the same quiet authority they had carried for years. From a distance, nothing appeared broken. Transactions moved as they always had. Salaries arrived on time. Prices changed, but not enough to unsettle the rhythm of daily life. The system continued to function, and because it functioned, it was trusted. What often goes unnoticed in such moments is not collapse, but weight. The gradual shift in what money represents, and more importantly, what it no longer holds. Currency does not lose its role overnight. It continues to circulate, to measure, to settle obligations. But beneath its surface function, something begins to thin. Not visibly at first, and rarely in a way that invites immediate concern. This thinning has a particular characteristic. It rarely begins in the places people are looking. It does not start at the market stall or the wage envelope. It begins in quieter spaces, where decisions are made about supply, about credit, about the acceptable balance between obligation and production. These decisions are often framed as temporary adjustments, necessary responses to pressure, technical corrections that maintain stability rather than disrupt it. And for a time, they do. There is a reason why monetary systems can endure these early shifts without visible strain. Modern currencies are built not only on reserves or output, but on expectation. The belief that tomorrow's value will resemble today's is what allows money to function as more than paper or digits. That belief absorbs small distortions. It smooths over inconsistencies. It allows systems to bend without appearing to break. But history suggests that this capacity is not infinite. It has limits, though they are rarely acknowledged, while the system remains operational. In the late stages of the Roman Republic, coinage continued to circulate widely even as its composition was quietly altered. The silver content declined incrementally, not enough to trigger immediate rejection, but enough to change what the coin represented over time. Soldiers were still paid. Markets still operated. Yet the underlying contract between issuer and holder had begun to shift. The coin looked the same. It moved the same. But it no longer carried the same weight. What mattered was not the act of debasement itself, but the gradual normalization of it. Each adjustment made the next one easier to justify. Each compromise redefined the baseline of what was considered acceptable. The system adapted, and in adapting, it moved further from its original foundation. This pattern has repeated in different forms across centuries, not always through metal content, but through expansion of supply, through redefinition of backing, through subtle changes in how value is anchored. The mechanism evolves, but the sequence remains familiar. Stability is preserved on the surface, even as the structure beneath it becomes more flexible, more dependent on continued confidence. Confidence, however, behaves differently from structure. It is not engineered in the same way. It cannot be reinforced indefinitely through policy or design. It responds to perception, and perception is shaped slowly, often without clear moments of transition. People do not wake up one morning and decide that money has changed. They adjust gradually. They notice small inconsistencies, then adapt to them. Prices rise in ways that are explained, then accepted. Savings hold their form, but not their function. The change is experienced, but not always named. This is where the sense of weight becomes important. Money is not only a medium of exchange, it is also a store of certainty. It allows individuals to carry value across time, to defer decisions, to plan beyond immediate need. When that capacity weakens, even slightly, behavior begins to shift. Not dramatically at first, but enough to alter the flow of the system itself. Spending patterns change. Holding patterns change. The relationship between present and future becomes less stable. And yet, the currency continues to circulate, maintaining the appearance of continuity. This dual reality, function without full weight, is what defines the early stages of monetary drift. It is not a crisis. It does not announce itself with urgency. It exists alongside normalcy, embedded within it. And because it does, it is often mistaken for it. The question is not when such a system will fail. History rarely provides clear timelines. The question is how long a system can continue to operate while gradually losing the qualities that once made it stable. How long it can rely on inherited trust while altering the conditions that created that trust in the first place. In many cases, the answer is longer than expected. Systems are resilient. They absorb pressure. They evolve. But, in evolving, they sometimes cross thresholds that are only visible in hindsight. By the time those thresholds are recognized, the shift has already taken place. The currency still exists. It still moves. But what it represents has changed in ways that cannot be easily reversed. This is where the idea of weight becomes less metaphorical and more structural. Not a question of value in isolation, but of what that value is anchored to and how firmly it holds. As this process unfolds, it rarely appears as a single break in continuity. There is no moment where value simply disappears. Instead, it migrates. Quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, moving through channels that are not always visible in official measures. What defines this movement is not panic, but adjustment. Systems built around a single, widely trusted medium begin to develop parallel behaviors. Not replacements, not yet, but alternatives that coexist with the dominant form of money. These alternatives are not always formal. Sometimes they take the shape of preferences, of tendencies that become more consistent over time. In Weimar Germany, before the collapse became visible in daily transactions, there were already signs that money was being treated differently. Businesses began to shorten payment terms. Individuals preferred goods over cash when possible. Contracts were adjusted, not because the currency had officially failed, but because its future was no longer assumed to be stable. The mark still circulated, still functioned, but its role as a reliable store had begun to erode. This erosion does not require a complete loss of confidence. It only requires a subtle shift in how confidence is applied. When money is trusted for immediate use, but not for long-term holding, its nature changes. It becomes transactional rather than preservational, useful in motion, but less so at rest. That distinction alters behavior in ways that compound over time. Producers begin to price not just for current costs, but for anticipated changes. Lenders become more cautious, or demand compensation for uncertainty. Savers look for ways to anchor their resources outside of the currency itself. None of these actions are extreme on their own. Each can be explained as rational, even prudent. But collectively, they reshape the system. The currency continues to circulate, but it is no longer the sole repository of trust. It shares that role with other forms, some tangible, some structural, some external to the system entirely. This diffusion of trust is not evenly distributed. It moves through networks, through knowledge, through access. Some recognize it earlier. Others encounter it only after the shift has become more pronounced. What becomes evident, in hindsight, is that value does not vanish during these periods. It relocates. It seeks forms that are less susceptible to the forces altering the currency. These forms vary depending on the structure of the economy, the nature of the pressure, and the options available within that context. In post-war France, periods of monetary instability led to increased reliance on land and durable goods as stores of value. In Latin America during the late 20th century, repeated episodes of inflation encouraged the use of foreign currencies alongside domestic ones, not as a replacement, but as a parallel measure of stability. In each case, the official system remained in place, but its exclusivity diminished. This is a key aspect of the pattern. Monetary systems do not always collapse in a binary sense. They often fragment. Their functions are distributed across multiple forms, each carrying a portion of what was once centralized. Exchange, storage, and measurement. These roles can separate, each attaching to different mechanisms. The consequence is not immediate dysfunction, but increasing complexity. Individuals and institutions must navigate multiple layers of value, each with its own characteristics, its own risks, its own time horizon. What was once straightforward becomes conditional. This conditionality introduces friction, not necessarily visible in daily transactions, but present in decision-making. Choices become more cautious, more contingent. The future becomes harder to price, not because it is unknowable, but because the unit used to measure it is less stable. Over time, this affects more than just financial behavior. It influences planning, investment, even social expectations. When the medium through which value is stored begins to lose consistency, the broader system adapts by shortening its horizons. Long-term commitments become less attractive. Immediate utility gains importance. Yet even within this adaptation, there is no clear moment of acknowledgement. The system continues to function. Wages are paid, goods are exchanged, the currency remains in use. But beneath this continuity, the underlying pattern is shifting. It is important to recognize that these changes do not occur uniformly. They are uneven, often subtle, and frequently dismissed in their early stages. They are interpreted as temporary distortions, as anomalies that will correct over time. And sometimes, for a while, they do. But the pattern suggests that when value begins to move away from its primary container, it does so with a certain persistence. Not rapidly, not dramatically, but with a direction that becomes clearer only when viewed across longer intervals. What appears stable in the present often contains within it the early stages of redistribution. Not of wealth in the traditional sense, but of where that wealth chooses to reside. The distinction is quiet, but significant. Because once value begins to settle elsewhere, returning it to its original form becomes increasingly difficult. Not impossible, but dependent on restoring the conditions that gave that form its weight in the first place. And those conditions, once altered, are rarely restored quickly. What makes these transitions difficult to recognize in real time is the persistence of appearance. The system does not announce its weakening. It continues to operate with enough continuity to reassure those who rely on it. Prices are still quoted in the same units. Accounts still reflect numerical growth. Obligations are still settled in familiar forms. The structure remains visible, even as its internal balance shifts. This is why the loss of weight in money is rarely experienced as a sudden absence. It is experienced as a gradual mismatch between effort and outcome, between holding and preserving, between what is measured and what is actually retained. In earlier periods, this mismatch often revealed itself through physical means. The coin contained less metal. The note required more volume to acquire the same goods. Today, the mechanisms are less tangible, but the effect follows a similar logic. The representation of value expands, while the capacity of that representation to hold purchasing power becomes less certain. The difficulty lies in the fact that this process does not follow a predictable timeline. There is no fixed point at which the system crosses from stability into instability. Instead, there are conditions, accumulated, layered, and often rationalized, that increase the likelihood of transition. Pressure on supply, expansion of obligations beyond output, the growing need to maintain continuity through intervention rather than through balance. These conditions can exist for extended periods without producing visible disruption. In fact, they often coexist with growth, with innovation, with outward signs of strength. This coexistence reinforces the belief that the system remains fundamentally sound, that any distortions are temporary, manageable, part of a larger cycle that will correct itself. But correction requires constraints. And when those constraints have been relaxed repeatedly to preserve stability, the system becomes more dependent on continued adjustment. Each intervention maintains the surface, but alters the foundations slightly further. Over time, this creates a situation where stability is no longer a byproduct of balance, but an outcome of constant management. The system holds, but it must be held. And in being held, it becomes more sensitive to shifts that were once absorbed without consequence. When those shifts occur, whether through external pressure, internal imbalance, or simple loss of confidence, they do not need to be large to have an effect. Because the system, having adapted to maintain stability, has less inherent capacity to absorb disruption without visible change. This is often the point at which the perception of weight begins to change more noticeably. Not because money has ceased to function, but because its reliability across time has become uncertain in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. It is here that the earlier movement of value becomes more apparent. What had been gradual, almost theoretical, begins to take on practical significance. The forms that had quietly accumulated trust during the earlier stages now carry greater importance, not as alternatives in principle, but as anchors in practice. These anchors differ across contexts. Sometimes they are physical, land, resources, objects with inherent utility. Sometimes they are structural, systems or networks that operate with a degree of independence from the primary currency. Sometimes they are external, units of value tied to different conditions, different constraints. What unites them is not their form, but their relationship to stability. They are perceived, rightly or not, as less exposed to the forces that are affecting the primary system. And because of that perception, they attract a portion of the trust that the primary system is gradually losing. This shift does not require universal agreement. It does not require a collective decision. It unfolds through individual actions, each responding to a sense, often unspoken, that holding value in one form carries more uncertainty than before. As more of these actions accumulate, the system reflects them, not immediately and not always visibly, but in ways that become clearer over time. The primary currency continues to circulate, but it shares its role more broadly. Its dominance becomes less absolute, even if its presence remains. What remains consistent across historical examples is not the specific form that value takes, but the direction it moves. Away from concentration toward distribution. Away from reliance on a single measure, toward a network of measures, each carrying part of the weight. And once this redistribution reaches a certain depth, reversing it becomes complex. Not because it is technically impossible, but because it requires rebuilding the conditions that made the original system sufficient on its own. Those conditions are rarely restored quickly. They depend on constraint, on balance, on a re-establishment of limits that may no longer align with the pressures the system faces. So the system continues, often for longer than expected. It adapts, it evolves, it maintains its outward form. But within that continuity, the question of where security actually resides becomes less straightforward. Not because security has disappeared, but because it no longer sits where it once did, with the same certainty, carrying